Just a nurse. That's what Dr. Hargrove called her, not to her face but close enough, a dismissal that hung in the air like antiseptic, sharp and impossible to ignore. Brooke Sullivan heard it anyway, the way she heard everything now. 18 months on the night shift at Sacred Heart ICU in Raleigh had taught her to move through the world as if she weren't in it. Her presence acknowledged the way you acknowledge the hum of a ventilator, constant, necessary, invisible. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead in their endless drone, cutting the darkness into geometric shapes across the unit's 12 beds. Antiseptic cut through the recycled air, mixing with something else, the copper-edged smell of blood, the ammonia of urine, the particular staleness that settles in a room where people don't get better. Brooke breathed it all in without changing her expression. Pain is data. Smells are information. She'd learned that a long time ago, in a place where the information kept you alive. She moved between beds with the kind of efficiency that went unnoticed because it was too perfect to seem human. Her hands organized the crash cart with military precision, not grouped by hospital protocol, but by trauma response sequence. Airway first. Breathing second. Circulation third. Everything else was silence. The glove snapped onto her hands like familiar skin. The supply cart rolled without squeaking. She'd fixed that weeks ago with a precision wrench from her personal kit, the one she kept hidden in the locker next to those boots. Those boots sat at the bottom of her locker now, polished but concealed beneath her civilian clothes, buried under gym shorts she never wore and a zip-up hoodie from a community college she'd never attended. Even her sister didn't know they existed. Emily had asked once, 3 years ago, if Brooke missed it. The answer had been silence, the kind of silence that answers every question. You don't miss a life that's taken away from you. You just learn to breathe without it. The boots were worn tan leather with reinforced stitching at the toe box, salt-stained from deserts that existed in her peripheral vision when she closed her eyes. The insoles were mold to feet that had walked 43 kilometers in one night carrying a wounded radioman. She kept them polished anyway. Habit is muscle memory. Muscle memory is the only loyalty that doesn't ask questions. At 0623, Brooke finished restocking the airway cart, 14-gauge angiocath needles, endotracheal tubes in sizes 6.0 through 8.5, video laryngoscope with fresh batteries, when the helicopter alert came through. Not a radio announcement. A feeling. She always knew before the overhead said it. The doors burst inward at 0624. 2 paramedics pushed a gurney through the entrance to the ICU, and the entire unit shifted. Even the monitors seemed to synchronize, their beeping creating a minor chord that made her teeth ache. The patient was a man in his 60s, face the color of old concrete, bleeding from a rupture in his abdomen that the field team had already mentioned 3 times, blunt force trauma. Training accident. Fell from a 30-foot platform. ETA'd out of consciousness twice. Respond to pain only. Bed 7, said Dr. Hargrove, who had materialized from the physician's lounge at the exact moment the alert came through. He always did, drawn like a shark to the smell of resource allocation decisions. Start 2 large-bore 4s. Trauma labs. Type and cross for 10 units. His reputation preceded him like an odor. 3 hospital board positions, all of them earned through marriage into the Fairfax family, whose name appeared on donation plaques throughout the building. His medical decisions were shaped by spreadsheets more than patient outcomes. He'd been heard to say, more than once, that some cases were economically terminal, too much intervention for too little statistical chance. The staff had learned not to argue with him. Arguing with Hargrove required a kind of professional confidence that most nurses didn't possess. Brooke had a different kind of confidence. She didn't use it. She moved to bed 7 and began the intake with practiced efficiency. The patient, she saw his name on the chart, Commander James retired, Coast Guard, was still responding to pain, which meant something was still fighting. His daughter stood against the wall, weeping in a way that suggested she believed what she was seeing. Brooke had learned not to make eye contact during those moments. Sympathy was a distraction. Focus was mercy. 2 large-bore 4s went in cleanly. 18-gauge catheter, right antecubital fossa first, then the left. She could have done it in her sleep. She could have done it in zero gravity. She could have done it while running, which she had done once, in Tikrit, while mortar fire painted the sky above the FOB and a radioman named Hernandez was bleeding out faster than 3 medics could push saline. The trauma labs came back within the hour, hemoglobin 6.2 and falling, lactate for 0.8, coagulation studies elevated. The commander was losing the battle inside his own body, his blood pressure dropping toward the threshold where organs began to fail. The ultrasound showed free fluid throughout the abdomen, blood pooling where it should never be. Surgical consult, Hargrove said, not as a question but as a courtesy announcement. The surgeons came at 0900. Then the intensivists. Then the emergency medicine attending. Then a hematologist, because somebody thought maybe a clotting disorder had contributed. Then an anesthesia specialist, a nephrologist, a cardiologist, each one arriving with the kind of careful dignity that suggested they'd been asked to participate in something important. By 11:30, the conference room had filled with doctors. Not 5. Not 10. 20. Exactly 20 physicians, each one examining the same chart, each one looking at the same desperate hemodynamics, each one coming to the same conclusion. Dr. Hargrove called the case review meeting at noon. Brooke heard about it from the charge nurse, who heard about it from a resident who had been invited. 20 doctors. They were assembling 20 doctors to examine whether a Coast Guard commander was worth saving. She didn't say anything. She went back to monitoring the 4 lines, checking urine output, documenting vital signs on the computer, all the invisible work that kept the machinery running. The commander was sedated now, his body still fighting while his mind slept. He had a daughter somewhere in the waiting room. She was probably praying. By 1400, the meeting was over. Dr. Hargrove entered the ICU with a chart folder that was much thicker than it had been that morning. He moved to bed 7 with the kind of purposeful stride that indicated a decision had been made, not a medical decision, but an institutional one. Brooke was adjusting the endotracheal tube, checking the cuff pressure with the kind of precision that suggested she'd done this maybe 1,000 times. Which she had. DNR order, Hargrove said quietly, though not quietly enough. We're recommending no further intervention. The words landed in the space between them like a verdict. Brooke didn't move her hands. Didn't change her expression. Just made a note on the tube cuff and continued her work. All 20 physicians concurred, he continued, and she heard the satisfaction in his voice, the pleasure of consensus, of authority validated. Further treatment is futile. It's a waste of resources and a prolonged dying process for the patient. She looked at the chart then. At the commander's face. At the monitors showing a heartbeat that was still there, still fighting. At the blood pressure line that was dropping but not yet gone. At the O2 saturation hovering at 94% on 15 liters of supplemental oxygen. Still fighting. The daughter? Brooke asked, and her voice came out steady. Deferential. The voice of someone who accepted institutional wisdom even when that wisdom felt like it was built on sand. Will be notified this evening. Palliative care will take over after that. He left before she could respond. Maybe he didn't expect her to respond. Maybe that was why he'd kept his voice quiet, the professional courtesy of not making her witness something she might want to object to. At 14:45, Maria Chen arrived for her shift, pushing through the ICU doors with the kind of contained energy that suggested she'd already lived 3 full days before her day officially started. Former Army medic, 2 tours in Afghanistan, the kind of person who moved through chaos the way other people moved through grocery stores, with a baseline assumption that everything would be organized in the end. She began her orientation to the unit, noting vitals, checking orders, reading the chart on each patient with the professional detachment of someone who had learned not to become emotionally invested in outcomes she couldn't control. She paused at bed 7. Looked at the commander's chart. Looked at the DNR order, signed by 20 physicians, declaring the case futile. Then she looked at Brooke, who was documenting her for care with mechanical precision, and she saw something that made her stop. Brooke's hands were absolutely steady as she worked, her movements the kind of precise that only came from training. Not nursing training. Something older. Something that lived in the space between muscle and bone, in the place where protocol becomes instinct. Maria watched for 30 seconds without moving. Then she turned back to her own assignments, but her eyes never quite left Brooke's face. There was something about the way this nurse moved. The way she touched the patient with the kind of care that suggested she'd held dying men together before. The way she organized supplies not by hospital standard but by combat protocol. The way she held absolute stillness in her composure while everyone around her was reacting to the DNR order like it was final. Maria had served with people like this before. People who moved through disaster the way other people moved through silence. People who didn't tremble. People who didn't break. People who kept fighting long after consensus had decided the fight was over. She didn't ask questions. Not yet. She just filed the observation away in the same place she filed all the other things about this hospital that didn't quite add up. Dr. Hargrove's voice carried across the entire ICU like a tank idling in a garage, deliberate, heavy, impossible to ignore. Brooke stood at the back of the group during morning rounds, her hands clasped in front of her scrubs, watching his shoulders square as he addressed the commander's daughter. The girl was 23, maybe 24, her eyes raw from 2 nights without sleep, her fingers wrapped around a cold coffee cup like it was the last solid thing in her life. The consensus is clear, Hargrove said, gesturing to the clipboard he'd been carrying all morning. 20 signatures. 20 doctors. 20 voices saying the same word, stop. Your father's injuries are catastrophic. Internal bleeding across multiple organ systems. The trajectory is not compatible with meaningful recovery. We've recommended a do not resuscitate order. The daughter's chin trembled. She didn't speak. Brooke felt the familiar pressure building behind her sternum, not panic, never panic, but something closer to the feeling she'd had in Tikrit when a convoy was minutes out and the casualty in front of her was already gone but she didn't have permission to stop working. She took a measured breath. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed their mechanical song. There are treatment options we haven't explored, Brooke said quietly. Her voice barely carried 5 feet, but in the silence of the ICU, it sounded like she'd shouted. Hargrove stopped mid-sentence. His eyes found her across the room with the precision of a sniper acquiring a target. I'm sorry, Nurse Sullivan, did you just contradict 20 board-certified physicians? The other nurses pretended to look at monitors. Nobody moved. The ventilator next to them wheezed its mechanical rhythm like nothing was happening. With respect, Doctor, Brooke said, I've seen patients recover from worse. She had. In a field hospital in Tikrit, where the definition of worse meant bleeding out on a cot that cost $43. Where a man with half his abdomen cauterized from an IED blast had walked out 6 weeks later. But she said none of that. She just stood there, her jaw level, her eyes meeting his. Hargrove stepped closer. His voice dropped but didn't soften. That was the thing about Hargrove, Brooke realized, he didn't need to shout to fill a room. His presence made the air pressure change. Your respect means nothing when paired with such staggering ignorance. You're a floor nurse playing hero with hospital resources that belong to patients with actual chances of survival. He turned to the commander's daughter as if Brooke had already ceased to exist. Please forgive our bleeding heart here. She watches too many medical dramas. The daughter looked away. Brooke didn't flinch. She didn't blink. Her hands remained clasped, her breathing steady, because 3 years ago she had made a choice to bury the person who would have responded to that, the person with calluses on her palms and scars on her shoulders and the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst. That person was still in there, but she'd locked the door. She'd thrown away the key. She'd spent 1,095 days convincing herself it worked. Hargrove finished rounds and moved to the next patient without looking back. 2 hours later, Brooke passed the unit bulletin board on her way to the medication dispensary and saw the typed notice pinned beneath the staff schedule. Her name jumped out first, Nurse B.E. Sullivan, printed in Arial 12 point, official and sterile. Below it, The charges: insubordination and inappropriate emotional involvement in patient care decisions. Formal written warning. Medical record attached. Dr. Marcus Hargrove, Chief of Medicine. She read it once. Twice. The third time she reached out as if to touch the paper, but her hand stopped 6 inches away. She didn't lower it. She didn't pull it back. She just held it there for 3 seconds, then turned and walked to the med room. That evening, at 6:11 p.m., Brooke sat in the break room with her shift meal, a container of Greek yogurt and almonds from the refrigerator, a bottle of water she'd filled from the tap that morning. The room had the particular silence of a place nobody wanted to be, fluorescent and cold. She was the only one there. At 6:52, Maria Chen walked in with 2 other nurses whose names Brooke had never quite memorized. They gathered their lunch containers from the refrigerator without acknowledging her. They exchanged the kind of glance that required no words. Then they turned and left together, their footsteps receding down the hallway toward the staff lounge that smelled like burnt popcorn and judgment. The empty table spread in front of Brooke like a promise. She took one measured breath. Then another. She opened the yogurt and ate 3 spoonfuls before setting the spoon down. Her hands were perfectly steady. Her face showed nothing. But something in the small muscle beneath her right eye twitched once, and a single tear escaped before she could stop it, not from fear, not from shame, but from the sharp, specific anger of a person who had been underestimated so many times that the word had stopped meaning anything. She wiped it with the back of her hand without changing position. The tear was gone before it finished falling. 5 minutes later, Hargrove passed the open doorway of the break room on his way to his office. He was carrying a folder, his jacket slung over one arm, his expression already focused on whatever came next. His power was like that, it didn't require his attention. It worked in the background, making calls to nursing schools, requesting credential verifications, hinting at irregularities that might or might not exist. Brooke spoke without rising from her chair. Her voice didn't carry anger or accusation. It was just a statement, delivered to the empty room, but she knew he would hear it. 20 doctors can be wrong if they've never held a dying man together with their bare hands in Tikrit. Hargrove's footsteps slowed. He paused in the doorway for a single second, the briefest hesitation, a slight frown creasing his forehead, and then he kept walking. His shoes continued down the hallway with their practiced rhythm, his mind already elsewhere, dismissing what he'd heard the same way he dismissed her objections during rounds. But that wasn't the worst part. The next morning, at 9:15 a.m., Brooke was changing the commander's chest dressing when Maria Chen entered the room. The routine had become automatic by now, removing the old gauze, inspecting the incision site for signs of infection, applying fresh antibiotic ointment with clinical precision. Brooke's hands moved with the fluid confidence of someone who had done this 10,000 times, but what Maria noticed, what made her freeze mid-handoff of sterile gauze, was the suture work underneath. The hospital protocol called for standard wound closure. The sutures should have been spaced at half-inch intervals, standard tension, standard technique. But Brooke's sutures were different. They were tighter. They were positioned at angles that wouldn't appear in any textbook Maria had studied, arranged to reinforce a small bleeding vessel that conventional hospital protocols wouldn't address until it became a crisis. It was the kind of field work you learned in combat medicine, in places where you didn't have time for textbook protocol because the casualty would be dead before textbook protocol finished its first step. Maria froze. The gauze hung in her outstretched hand. Brooke noticed the pause without looking up. "You okay?" She kept working, her voice flat, her hand steady as a surgical laser. "That suture work," Maria whispered. "Where did you serve?" Brooke's hands paused. Not trembled. Not shook. Paused. A single heartbeat of hesitation, then resumed. "I didn't." But Maria's eyes had already dropped to the wound care, and she was already reading the story written in modified sutures and reinforced vessel placement and the kind of combat efficiency that didn't come from 4 years of nursing school. It came from somewhere else. It came from somewhere that shaped your hands in ways that civilian medicine couldn't teach. She didn't push. Not yet. But as she helped Brooke finish the dressing change, as they worked in synchronized silence, Maria understood that there was more to this nurse than shift schedules and quiet objections during rounds. There was something underneath, something held down by conscious effort, something that showed in the way her hands moved when she didn't think anyone was really looking. At 2:08 p.m., Hargrove pulled Brooke into his office. He was in his element now, having made phone calls, having exercised his network of connections through his wife's family's hospital board affiliations. He closed the door with careful precision. "I've been speaking with your former educators," he said, not sitting down, forcing her to look up at him from the patient chair. "There seem to be some questions about your credentials. Some irregularities in your licensing history." Brooke didn't respond. She waited, her composure holding like a dike against floodwater. "I'm watching you, Sullivan. One more step out of line and I'll have your license reviewed by the state board. Do you understand?" "Yes, doctor. That's all." She left his office and returned to the ICU, where the machines beeped and the monitors glowed and nobody spoke to her at all, and at 11:33 p.m., when the night shift supervisor left for her break and only 2 nurses remained on the entire floor, the commander's monitors began to scream. At 0300, the cardiac monitor began its screaming. 3 short bursts. Then silence. Then the low, steady wail of a flat line. Brooke's head snapped up from the medication cart where she'd been restocking syringes, muscle memory overriding exhaustion. The sound of a heart giving up was unmistakable. She'd heard it 17 times before, 13 of them in places where there were no machines to announce the death, just the sudden weight of a body going slack in your arms. She moved before thinking. The pericardiocentesis kit was in the crash cart, 3rd drawer, left side. She'd memorized the location of every instrument in this unit the way soldiers memorize their weapons, not as conscious knowledge but as instinct. Her hands knew where to go. Her mind was already 3 steps ahead, running the calculus. Cardiac tamponade. Fluid in the sac around the heart. The pressure building, crushing. The heart drowning in its own protective barrier. The on-call physician was Dr. Marcus Webb, a hospitalist who'd been trained to read his appointment calendar like a scripture. Brooke punched his number into the hospital phone, already moving toward the commander's room. She heard the ringtone. Once. Twice. On the 3rd ring, his voice came through, thick with sleep, irritated by the disturbance. "It's the ICU. Commander retired, bed 7. Cardiac arrest. Possible tamponade." Silence. She could hear him breathing, calculating, deciding whether this was his problem. "The patient has a DNR. Dr. Hargrove's orders are clear. Let nature take its course. Call him if there's an issue." The line went dead. Brooke entered the commander's room. The monitor showed the flat line persisting, that horrible unbroken line that meant the electrical system had catastrophically failed. His chest wasn't moving. His eyes were open and unseeing. The ventilator continued its mechanical rhythm, useless now, breathing for a body that was already leaving. "I need a crash tray," she said to the night nurse standing frozen in the doorway. "And anesthesia at the bedside. Now." "But the DNR is overridden by an acute, reversible condition that I can treat in the next 90 seconds. Move." The authority in her voice, cold, precise, borrowed from a rank she hadn't worn in 3 years, broke whatever paralysis had gripped the other nurse. Footsteps. Running now. The sound of a crash cart being wheeled at speed, the metallic rattle of instruments shifting inside. Brooke opened the pericardiocentesis kit with the focused intensity of someone preparing for something that mattered. The needle was 18 gauge, 3.5 inches long, sterile and gleaming under the fluorescent lights that hummed their constant electronic prayer. The ultrasound machine was being wheeled in. Good, Maria Chen from the night shift had understood immediately. No hesitation. Just competence recognizing competence. "Left 5th intercostal space, midclavicular line," Brooke said. Not a request. A statement. Maria positioned the ultrasound probe, scanning quickly, finding the collection of fluid that was suffocating the commander's heart. On the screen, it appeared as a dark shadow, a growing pool of blood filling the space where there should have been nothing. "There," Maria said. 3 centimeters at least. Brooke's hands didn't shake. They'd done this before in Tikrit, not with ultrasound machines and sterile fields, but with field-expedient needle decompression in a makeshift aid station while mortar rounds walked their way across the compound. Pain is information, and her hands remembered the language. She swabbed the skin with chlorhexidine, watched the amber iodine spread across his ribs like a map of something she'd already learned to read. The needle went in at a shallow angle, advancing slowly, feeling for the resistance of the pericardium, that tough membrane that had become a death trap. 15 milliliters, she said aloud, documenting what was happening as it happened. Clear fluid. Probably serous. The hiss of air escaping, no, she corrected herself silently, concentrating, the slow release of pressure. The needle advanced. She felt the subtle give as the sharp tip penetrated the fluid sac. And then, like the exhalation of a body that had been holding its breath too long, the fluid began to withdraw into the syringe. 20 milliliters. 30. The monitor behind her began to change. The flat line rippled. A single blip appeared. Then another. The electrical system waking up like a city coming out of blackout. Sinus rhythm, Maria whispered. Brooke didn't stop. 40 milliliters. The fluid kept coming, clear and amber, each syringe representing pressure that had been crushing the heart, preventing it from beating. On the monitor, the rhythm strengthened. 45 milliliters. The vital signs display began to show numbers again, blood pressure registering at 78 systolic, climbing, pushing toward something survivable. Oxygen saturation rising. Heart rate establishing at 89 beats per minute, regular and true. BP 106/62 and holding, Maria said. Relief flooded her voice. He's coming back. Brooke placed a sterile dressing over the needle insertion site with the same precision a jeweler might use to set a diamond. The commander's chest rose and fell with the ventilator. His color, which had been the gray of concrete, began to warm toward something recognizably human. The monitors continued their electronic affirmation, beep, 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 a rhythm that meant life persisting. She documented the procedure in the medical record with timestamps exact to the minute. Pericardiocentesis performed at 0307 hours. Needle insertion second intercostal space midclavicular line. Fluid aspirated, 52 milliliters, clear, serous appearance. Hemodynamic response immediate and sustained. Patient returned to normal sinus rhythm. Vital signs now stable within acceptable parameters. All equipment verified. All readings confirmed. The documentation was meticulous, not defensive, just precise. This was what it looked like when someone who knew what she was doing performed an emergency procedure correctly. The night shift supervisor appeared at the doorway at 0327, drawn by the commotion. She stared at the bedside, at the commander's steady vital signs, at Brooke standing calmly beside the bed with the pericardiocentesis kit already being returned to its protective container. What happened? The supervisor asked, her voice small. Cardiac tamponade, Brooke said. The fluid around the heart was causing collapse of the cardiac chambers. Standard emergency treatment. He's stable now. His surgeon needs to be notified for definitive management. She finished her documentation at the bedside, her handwriting steady and practiced, the kind of penmanship that comes from years of writing exact medical details under adverse conditions. Each letter precise. Each number clear. The record would show exactly what happened and exactly who performed it. The phone on the unit began ringing at 0405. Dr. Hargrove's voice came through sharp and demanding, drawn awake by an automated critical intervention alert. What's this notification about the retired patient? I authorized a DNR. Nobody was supposed to intervene. The patient went into cardiac tamponade at 0300, the night supervisor said, glancing at Brooke. An emergency procedure was performed. He's stable now. The silence that followed lasted 3 seconds. Brooke counted them. 1, 2, 3. "I'm coming in," Hargrove said. And then, quieter, "Who performed the procedure?" The supervisor's eyes found Brooke's. The question hung between them like a held breath. "Sullivan." "The night nurse." When Hargrove arrived at 0425, moving through the ICU with the fury of a man whose authority had been directly challenged, Brooke was still at the bedside, adjusting the ventilator settings, checking the chest tube drainage that the trauma surgeon had placed emergently, ensuring that everything was documented, recorded, justified by the medical record itself. She didn't turn when he approached. She continued her work with the same attention she'd been using all night, not defensive, not nervous, just thorough. He stopped 3 feet away. She could feel him staring. "What did you do?" His voice was ice-cut in 2 syllables. "Pericardiocentesis," Brooke replied without turning. "Standard emergency protocol for cardiac tamponade." The patient's vital signs were incompatible with life. The procedure was reversible, curative, and performed under time pressure that made physician notification impractical. "You performed a procedure reserved exclusively for physicians." Each word was measured, precise, delivered like courtroom testimony. "You violated direct orders. You used hospital resources. He stopped, and she heard it then, the micro shift in his breathing that meant he understood. Not that she'd saved a life. Not that she'd followed proper emergency medicine protocol. That he'd been overridden. That his DNR order, his cost-efficiency calculation, had been proven wrong by a nurse. "You just ended your career," he said. But his voice had changed. The certainty was there, but beneath it was something that sounded like fear. Dr. Hargrove arrived at 0320 in the cardiac ICU, his movements deliberate, his expression arranged into something that resembled concern but tasted like ash. 20 minutes had passed since the alert. 20 minutes of his authority being unmade by a nurse with steady hands and a defiance he couldn't tolerate. The commander's monitor sang its steady beep, sinus rhythm, oxygenation climbing, blood pressure stabilizing in real time. Brooke stood at the bedside, documentation complete, her scrub still damp at the collar, her pen already capped and returned to her pocket. She didn't look at him. She didn't need to. "You performed a procedure without physician authorization." Not a question. A declaration, the way a judge announces a sentence. The patient was in cardiac tamponade. On-call refused to respond. Vital signs were collapsing. Her voice carried no defense, no plea. Just fact. Just information delivered to someone no longer worthy of her deference. He turned to leave, but his pace had changed. The confident stride had fractured into something faster, more urgent. "You've just ended your career at this hospital." By 0800, the administrative office had transformed into a war room. Hargrove convened an emergency board meeting via conference call and in-person attendance. 6 board members gathered, 3 of them partners in his referral network, cardiologists who sent their private patients to him in exchange for favorable testimony and lucrative consulting contracts. 2 of them owed him favors worth roughly $180,000 each in deferred referral fees. These were the men and women who moved the machinery of institutional power. And Hargrove knew exactly which levers to pull. "She committed fraud," he told them, his voice crisp and authoritative. "Falsified credentials. She has no authority to perform invasive procedures. The state licensing board needs to be notified immediately. We're talking federal jurisdiction here, practicing medicine without a license is a felony." The board members exchanged glances. Nobody asked for evidence. Nobody asked for context. One of them, a surgeon named Hayes who'd sent Hargrove 6 cardiac referrals last quarter alone, nodded. "How quickly can we move on suspension?" "She'll be barred from the premises within 6 hours. I'll have HR draft the termination paperwork pending investigation." By 1400, Brooke received the notification. Not in person. Not with dignity. A manila envelope delivered to her locker by someone who wouldn't meet her eyes. Inside, immediate suspension, pending investigation into practicing medicine without a license, falsification of nursing credentials, violation of hospital policy section 4.7 subsection C. The letter was written in the bland passive voice of institutional cruelty. It is the determination of this hospital that. Nobody signed it. Nobody stood behind it. Just the machine, grinding. The next morning, Hargrove made calls to her nursing school references, professors who remembered her as quiet, competent, unremarkable. He didn't ask questions so much as plant suggestions. We're investigating some credential discrepancies. Any concerns with her background check? The professors, uncomfortable, defensive of their institution, offered qualified support that sounded like doubt. Then he called the North Carolina State Board of Nursing Licensing Office and filed formal allegations. Falsified military background. Possible fraud in initial credentialing. I'm genuinely concerned about patient safety, he told the investigator, his voice dripping with the paternal concern of a man protecting the vulnerable. She demonstrated increasingly unstable behavior, made concerning references to combat trauma, and then performed a procedure she had no authority to perform. The licensing board opened a file. Case number 2024 NC 07743. Brooke sat in the waiting room of the Durham VA hospital on a Thursday afternoon, surrounded by the particular brokenness that only military service creates. A man with one leg read the same page of a magazine over and over. A woman with trembling hands filled out a medical history form she clearly didn't understand. An older Marine in a wheelchair stared at nothing, his eye somewhere in Fallujah or Kandahar or one of the 100 places where America's wars had carved permanent residence in the brain. The fluorescent lights hummed their antiseptic hymn. The smell of industrial cleaner mixed with something like despair, not a smell, really, but the absence of hope, which somehow smelled worse. She held an intake form in both hands. Service history. The form asked for dates, rank, unit designation, medical discharge status. The pen trembled. Not from fear. From the weight of 3 years of not writing these things down, of pretending the military version of herself had been filed away like old uniforms in a donation bin. Senior Chief Petty Officer. That was the rank. 12 years, 3 months, 16 days. But the form only had lines. It didn't have space for the things that mattered. Didn't have a line for Tikrit Regional Medical Facility, 2006. Didn't have a line for 47 lives. Didn't have a checkbox for the faces that still came at 3 a.m., asking why they'd lived when better people died. She couldn't write it. The pen hovered. The fluorescent lights buzzed. A veteran with a service dog walked past, and the dog, somehow sensing what the man in the wheelchair could not say, pressed its head against her knee. She set the pen down. Her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. This is Maria Chen. The Army medic from Sacred Heart. I know what happened. I know who you are. You need to know something is changing. Call me. The message felt like a grenade with the pin already pulled, the safety lever gone, just waiting. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was sitting in that waiting room, surrounded by men and women who had sacrificed everything, and realizing she'd sacrificed her own name to do exactly what the VA taught you not to do, hide the wound until it infected everything. The infection had started in Tikrit. It had metastasized through 3 years of scrubs and quiet composure and combat boots hidden in a locker like contraband. She stared at the incomplete form. At her name printed at the top, Sullivan, Brooke Catherine. The person the form was asking about didn't exist. Or maybe she existed too much. Maybe she was the only thing that had ever existed, and everything since had been the pretense. The veteran with the trembling hands looked at her. Really looked. Saw something. You served. His voice was gravel filtered through whiskey. Brooke didn't answer. But she folded the form and stood up. Walked out of that waiting room. Left the intake form on the desk with a note, I'll call to reschedule. She needed to go back to Sacred Heart. Not to defend herself. To find out who had broken the silence that was supposed to keep her invisible. Commander Retired regained consciousness at 4:17 a.m. on the fourth day, his eyes moving beneath closed lids before they opened to the rhythmic beep of the cardiac monitor. The ventilator wheezed its mechanical breath. His daughter Sarah was asleep in the chair beside him, her hand still wrapped around his. 3 floors below, in the Federal Crimes Unit's temporary office set up in Sacred Heart's administrative wing, an FBI investigator named Patterson was laying out emails on a conference table, 47 of them, each one documenting Dr. Hargrove's communications with hospital board members, each one revealing the systematic architecture of his fraud. Patterson had been tracking Medicare violations for 6 months. What he found in the last 72 hours had escalated everything. Hargrove had accessed Brooke Sullivan's personnel file after hours on the night of her suspension. Security camera footage showed him entering the records room at 11:43 p.m., the timestamp burned into the digital feed like a confession. He had spent 17 minutes in there. Alone. And when he left, a fabricated addendum was in her file, a backdated document claiming Brooke's nursing school credentials contained discrepancies, her transcripts allegedly altered, her RN license potentially fraudulent. The document was a forgery. A professional one. But forged nonetheless. It had been created by Hargrove's brother-in-law, a consultant who charged $3,000 per week and whose entire job was creating plausible-looking credential checks for clients who needed leverage. Hargrove had attempted to destroy a nurse's career using a falsified federal document. The FBI doesn't move slowly on that kind of thing. What they didn't know, what Patterson was about to discover in the next 6 hours, was that Hargrove had also contacted 2 members of the state licensing board, colleagues from his wife's country club, and pressured them to open an investigation into Brooke's credentials before she could even be formally charged with practicing medicine without a license. He had drafted the language they would use. He had, in effect, written the fraud himself and asked his friends to execute it on official letterhead. The investigation into Dr. Hargrove's board dealings reached Sacred Heart at dawn. Not as a quiet inquiry. As a lockdown. FBI agents in dark jackets moved through the administrative offices with the precision of a tactical team. They cordoned off the records room. They seized computers. They requested all documents related to the commander's case, the pericardiocentesis procedure, and the DNR conference that had convened 20 doctors for a presentation on cost-benefit analysis. 20 doctors. All of them present. All of them signing. All of them about to be interviewed individually. In the ICU that morning, something extraordinary happened. A former Iraqi insurgent named Khalid was wheeled into Trauma Bay 3, shrapnel embedded in his lower abdomen, his vitals unstable, his paperwork stamped with an asylum approval dated 3 weeks prior. He had survived the war that had taken everyone else. He had made it to America. And now infection was eating through his abdomen like a slow fire. The surgical team was prepping for emergency debridement when Khalid's eyes found the nurse moving through the bay with a pericardiocentesis tray, equipment that had no business being in a trauma room, but Brooke was checking it anyway, muscle memory never forgetting what hands might need in a moment of crisis. Khalid's eyes widened. His mouth opened. And he began speaking in rapid Arabic, words tumbling over each other like he was afraid she would disappear if he didn't say them fast enough. The translator wasn't present yet, so the words came with no context, just urgency and tears running down his face. A resident nearby was fluent. He listened. He turned to Brooke. "He says you saved his life," the resident translated. "In a field hospital in Tikrit. After his own people left him. He says you're the reason he's alive." Brooke didn't flinch. She continued prepping the bay, her hands moving with the same steady precision she had learned in a military trauma unit 18 years ago. But something in the room's temperature changed. The other nurses looked at her. The resident looked at her. The monitors beeped their indifferent rhythm. Khalid kept speaking, his voice rising, his hand reaching toward her even as the surgical team positioned him for the procedure. "Angel," he was saying in English now, the one word he clearly knew. "Angel. You are the angel." 3 floors below, the commander's daughter had woken up. She had researched through the night using military databases her father had access to, old-fashioned phone calls to retired officers, and a determination that surprised even her. She had a name. She had a rank. And she had something else, a personnel file that documented 12 Navy and Coast Guard commendations, 3 tours, and a medical discharge dated 7 years ago. She had walked into the hospital lobby at 7:04 a.m. with that information burning in her chest like fuel. And she had said it aloud, loud enough for the morning shift to hear, "She's not just a nurse. She's Senior Chief Petty Officer Sullivan." The words hung there. Suspended. Real and impossible at the same time. Brooke was still in the ICU with Khalid, still moving through the pre-surgical checklist, still invisible. But by 7:02 a.m., a message had reached her. Maria Chen found her in the supply room and whispered 3 words, "They know." Everywhere. Brooke didn't ask what they knew. She already understood. The invisible was over. The boots in her locker weren't hidden anymore. Neither was she. She walked into the lobby at 8:15 a.m. It was crowded now. Hospital administration had been called. Security was present. The commander's daughter stood near the front desk, and on the administrator's desk behind them, laid open like an accusation and a vindication all at once, was Brooke's personnel file. Her discharge papers. Her citation records. The life she had buried. Her hand shook, not from fear. From restraint. From 18 years of keeping herself small and staying invisible suddenly ending all at once. She read the citations as the room watched. Navy and Marine Corps Commendation Medal. Bronze Star with Valor. A second Bronze Star with Valor. 3 Purple Hearts. And then a man in dress blue stepped forward, a SEAL team leader named Mitchell who had trained with her unit in 2008, who had seen her work, who had recommended her for promotion twice. He stood at attention, and he began to read aloud. Navy and Marine Corps Commendation Medal, for exceptional service under fire at Forward Operating Base Shank, 2009. The room was silent. The fluorescent lights hummed their indifferent song. First Bronze Star with Valor, for actions during an active firefight in Helmand Province, 2011. She shielded 3 wounded Marines with her own body while administering combat first aid. Sarah's hand was covering her mouth. Khalid, now stable and post-surgical, was being wheeled past on his way to recovery, and he saw Brooke and began speaking in Arabic again, repeating the same word, angel. Angel. Second Bronze Star with Valor, for leading a medical evacuation under active hostile fire, 2012. 8 personnel extracted. 0 casualties. 3 Purple Hearts. That was what they didn't mention in the official citations. The shrapnel wound in her leg. The IED blast that had ruptured her eardrums. The infection that had nearly taken her arm. 3 times wounded. 3 times returned to duty. 3 times because the alternative was leaving her people behind. When Mitchell finished reading, the room didn't applaud. The silence was different now. It was the silence of people understanding they had been standing next to a legend and mistaking her for a janitor. It was the silence of recognition. It was the silence of shame. That's when the parking lot erupted. FBI agents led Dr. Hargrove out of the administrative offices in handcuffs. Not roughly. Professionally. But visibly. News vans had already arrived. Someone had tipped the local media about the arrest, which meant the federal investigation was becoming public, which meant Hargrove's name was about to be everywhere. His attorney was shouting something about due process. His face was the color of old concrete. He looked smaller than he had during rounds. Fear does that to people. It shrinks them. Hospital staff watched from every window. They saw the perp walk. They saw the man who had signed 20 doctors' names to a DNR order being placed in the back of a federal vehicle. They saw the man who had tried to destroy a nurse's career being removed from the building like infectious material. The local news crew captured every second of it. By nightfall, the headlines would be everywhere: prominent Raleigh physician arrested for Medicare fraud, evidence tampering. The investigation took 3 weeks to complete formally, but the outcome was never in doubt. Security footage, emails, the forged documents, the testimony of board members who had felt pressured by Hargrove to open investigations. 16 of the 20 doctors who had signed the DNR admitted they had done so based entirely on Hargrove's cost-benefit presentation, without independent evaluation of the commander's condition. 16 signatures without thought. Hargrove's influence had been like gravity, it bent everything around it until people forgot they had choice. The hospital administrator issued a public apology to Brooke on day 23 of the investigation. It was formal and inadequate, the kind of apology that comes too late and never quite reaches far enough. But it was something. The medical board suspended Hargrove's license immediately. His 3 board positions evaporated as soon as board members realized association with him was toxic. His practice was dissolved. His wife's family, recognizing a career-ending liability, stopped returning his calls. By month 2, he had nothing. No license. No job. No social standing. No future that looked like anything he had built. 6 months later, Brooke Sullivan stood in the Durham VA hospital in fresh scrubs and polished combat boots, not hidden anymore, but visible and ready. She had been hired as a consultant to train emergency staff in combat trauma techniques, her rank officially recognized, her experience finally deployed where it could help the people who needed it most. The commander had made a full recovery. His daughter Sarah had become an advocate for better veteran healthcare access, her father's brush with death transformed into action. Khalid had been discharged and sent to a rehabilitation facility, his shrapnel wounds healing, his second chance at life already in motion. Dr. Hargrove, stripped of his medical license and awaiting trial on federal charges, worked from a folding table outside a strip mall in Durham, selling supplemental insurance policies to people who didn't know who he was or what he had done. Occasionally, a veteran would walk past and recognize his face from news coverage. They would keep walking. Sometimes they would say something quiet. Usually they didn't need to. One afternoon, Brooke returned to Sacred Heart. The ICU break room was full during shift change. The other nurses made space at the table without being asked. Maria Chen waved her over. And on the bulletin board where Brooke's written warning had once hung, framed now in dark wood, was a photograph, Brooke in dress uniform, younger, standing with her medical unit in Tikrit, hands on the shoulders of 2 people she had saved. Her citations hung beside the photo, each one visible, each one real. That evening, sitting alone in her apartment, Brooke opened her personnel file one final time. She read her own citations without trembling. She opened her locker and looked at the combat boots, still ready, still waiting, but no longer hidden. She thought of Hargrove at his folding table, of the 20 doctors who had signed without looking, of the choice she had made at 0300 when it mattered. Of Khalid. Of the commander. Of all the invisible work that had finally become visible. She closed the locker and said aloud to the empty room, "True class is what you do when the lights go out." The boots stayed in the locker. Polished. Ready. No longer ashamed. If this story resonates with you, if you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your true value, subscribe now and hit that notification bell. Drop a comment below. What would you have done in Brooke's position? Would you have saved him, or would you have walked away? And share this with someone who needs to know that the quiet ones are often the strongest. You have no idea who's standing next to you.